In a way, it's refreshing to hear the news from Istanbul that Ukraine and Russia will meet again to have further talks. But it's been a week of extraordinary contradictions in Russia's performance. On the one hand, a gesture towards peace. Moscow and Kyiv have agreed in principle to further ceasefire discussions in Istanbul. On the other hand, there's escalating military activity near the Finnish border and spontaneously anti-conscription uprisings in Russia itself. It'd be tempting to ask whether Vladimir Putin is playing chess or simply thrashing around like a cornered animal. My suspicion is the latter. But let's examine the evidence. That is a cornered frozen animal, of course. It's like you're taking your frozen chicken back home from Tesco's and finding that it still has the semblance of life, if not actual life. It's sort of making noises in the fridge. Talks between Russia and Ukraine and the delegations resumed in Istanbul this morning, and the first direct peace engagement since 2022 took place. The meeting was brief, under 2 hours, and culminated in a vague promise of future talks. Russia's lead negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky, insists that Ukraine must cede the entirety of 4 oblasts before Russia will entertain further conversations. The entirety, that includes the area that Russia doesn't control in full, nor has any legitimate claim to under international law. Ukraine, understandably, will not conceal what it has not militarily lost. President Zelensky has agreed to further dialogue, possibly even in person, and astonishingly appears more willing than his adversary to meet face-to-face. Putin, meanwhile, has fallen silent, neither committing to attendance nor acknowledging Zelensky's challenge. The Istanbul talks are no more than diplomatic theatre, a stage-managed delay tactic dressed up as statesmanship. What we are witnessing is not negotiation but narrative control, with Moscow attempting to shift the blame for peace's failure back onto Kyiv. And while speaking of peace, Russia has simultaneously massed forces along the 100-mile Finnish border. Satellite imagery reveals an unprecedented concentration of bomber aircraft at Olynya Air Base, 45 in total, including Tu-95 and Tu-22M3 long-range bombers, both nuclear capable. Add to this 130 tents erected near Kamenka to accommodate 2,000 troops, new hangars and armoured vehicles in Petrozavodsk. Add to this 130 tents erected near Kamenka to accommodate 2,000 troops, new hangars and armoured vehicles in Petrozavodsk, and increased combat helicopter activity at Severomorsk. This isn't bluffing, it's deterrence by intimidation designed to send Finland and NATO a clear message: we're watching, we're ready. Is this theatre again? Yeah, but theatre with tanks. And with the bulk of Russia's military bogged down in Ukraine, it's unlikely that an actual invasion of Finland is imminent. Nevertheless, the performance is enough to stretch NATO's attention and resources, perhaps thinning Western resolve in Ukraine itself. Yet even as Putin brandishes strength abroad, the grasp at home is faltering. In villages such as Krasnoye Pole in the Belgorod region, spontaneous resistance has erupted in response to forced conscription raids. Families have blocked roads with tractors. Mothers have wept in public squares, chanting, "We will not give our children." What began as a local protest quickly swelled, and by the time police cracked down with water cannon and rubber bullets, dozens were injured, scores arrested, and the face of the revolt, the farmer Alexei Morozov, lost 2 sons on the front. His cry, "We are not soldiers, we are defending our fields," could well be the epitaph of Putin's domestic myth. This is not a colour revolution, it's more dangerous than that. It's rural Russia, historically Putin's stronghold, beginning to say no. And given the fact that, you talk to Russians and you realise what the real story is, but very few are prepared to stand up and actually protest, and now they are. So we have 2 competing domestic narratives. The first is theatrical strength, bomber deployments, talks in Istanbul, and Putin's continued refusal to blink. Well, you don't blink if you're dead, do you? The second is involuntary exposure, the mobilization of unwilling men, rural unrest, and the slow erosion of Putin's social contract with his people. It's not sustainable. If Putin continues to play his war to avoid humiliation abroad, he risks revolution at home. But to accept anything less than total capitulation from Ukraine would be to betray the grotesque myth he has built over the last 3 years that Ukraine is run by Nazis, that the West is weak, and that Russia is morally and militarily superior. This myth is beginning to crack. Now, President Trump, ever the opportunist, has undermined European unity by urging Ukraine to entertain Russia's diplomatic pantomime. His gut feeling that Russia will suddenly honour a ceasefire is naivety at best, collusion at worst. And meanwhile, European leaders have set a deadline, 30 days for a ceasefire or further sanctions, and yet that may not be enough. As General Bill Slim once said, hit the other fellow as hard as you can where it hurts him most and when he ain't looking. If Putin is bluffing, let's call it. If he's not, let's be ready. And a really interesting development, which I hope Caelan Robertson is going to give more details about. He's been doing some research into the sheer number of people who've been called to Moscow to do puff pieces to say how brilliant Russia is. People from the European Union, journalists, politicians, baby politicians, but politicians nevertheless, going to Moscow and saying everything is wonderful, when we know everything isn't. This is a make or break week, not just for Ukraine, but for the coherence of Western strategy. And Russia's war cannot be solved by diplomacy alone, because it's not at root a dispute, it's an imperial tantrum. And Putin may refuse to turn up in Istanbul. He's refused this time, he may refuse next time. But he cannot refuse to recognize the slow crumbling of his illusion. In the north, NATO is watching. At home, the people are stirring. And in Kyiv, a nation that was meant to collapse in 3 days is still standing 3 years later.